The first rock came through the window at 3 in the morning, shattering glass across the bedroom floor where Connor Hayes and his daughter had been sleeping for exactly 2 nights. The second followed before he could even process the first, carrying a note wrapped around it with rubber bands that landed on the mattress between them. By the time Connor reached the window, the truck that had idled in the Foundry's gravel lot was already tearing down the access road, its taillights disappearing into the Kentucky darkness like coals cooling in water. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His daughter Sophie sat up in the sleeping bag they'd zipped together for warmth, her 11-year-old face pale in the moonlight. She didn't scream, didn't cry, just watched her father with the kind of calm that came from a childhood spent on military bases, where security alerts were routine. Connor had taught her not to panic, though he'd never imagined he'd need to deploy that training in his dead uncle's Foundry. "Stay there," he said, his voice carrying the automatic authority of 15 years as an Army combat engineer. He moved to the broken window carefully, boots crunching on glass, scanning the darkness beyond for movement, for the glint of metal, for anything that suggested this was more than intimidation. The note was simple, block letters written in black marker on torn cardboard. "Leave now, or it gets worse." No signature, no explanation, just the kind of threat that was meant to be taken seriously because it came in the middle of the night wrapped around a rock thrown at a child's window. Connor stood there holding the note, his jaw tight, thinking about the $600 in his bank account, the truck with 200,000 miles that had barely made the drive from North Carolina, and the fact that this abandoned Foundry was the only property he had any claim to after his uncle Raymond died 3 months ago. The lawyer's letter had been clear. Raymond Hayes had left the Foundry and its 3 acres to Connor, his only living relative, along with a handwritten note that said simply, "It's yours if you want it. Don't let them take it." He'd assumed them meant developers or the county trying to seize it for unpaid taxes. He hadn't expected someone to start throwing rocks through windows 48 hours after arrival. Sophie appeared beside him despite his instruction to stay put, her small hand taking his. "Is it about the Foundry?" she asked, her voice steady. "Probably." Connor knelt, putting himself at her eye level. "But nobody's going to run us off, okay? We've slept in worse places than this." That was true, though not by much. The Foundry was a hulking brick structure built in 1923, 3 stories of industrial decay with most of its equipment salvaged or stolen over the 15 years since Raymond had shut it down. The office space where they'd set up camp had a roof that mostly held and walls that blocked the November wind, but calling it livable was generous. They'd spent 2 days cleaning one room enough to sleep in, using a camping stove for heat and bottled water for washing. But it was theirs. Or it would be, once the property transfer went through. Raymond's will had been clear, and the lawyer handling the estate said there were no other claims, just paperwork and patience. And then Connor would own something for the first time in his adult life. A broken Foundry wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had 6 months ago when Sophie's mother had shown up at his apartment with their daughter and a suitcase, said she couldn't do it anymore, and walked away for good. Connor swept up the glass while Sophie held a flashlight, both of them quiet in the way they'd learned to be when military housing had paper-thin walls and other families were sleeping. When the floor was safe, he taped cardboard over the broken window and checked the other windows for signs of additional visitors. The Foundry sat on the edge of Ashland Ridge, a town that had thrived when metalwork was profitable and had slowly deflated when cheaper overseas manufacturing made local foundries obsolete. Raymond had been the last holdout, keeping the Foundry operational through the 80s and 90s by specializing in custom metalwork for restoration projects. He'd had contracts with historical societies, old money families maintaining estates, anyone who needed period-accurate ironwork for buildings that predated mass production. Connor had spent summers here as a kid, watching his uncle bend metal into impossible shapes, learning that heat and pressure could transform raw materials into something useful. Those summers had stopped when Connor was 14 and his mother died. Raymond had driven 6 hours for the funeral, stood silent at the graveside, then disappeared back to his foundry without offering to take in his sister's newly orphaned son. Connor had gone into foster care, enlisted at 18, and hadn't spoken to his uncle in 15 years, until the lawyer's call came saying Raymond had died of a heart attack and left everything to his nephew. As dawn broke through the remaining windows, Connor made coffee on the camping stove and surveyed what he'd inherited. The main foundry floor was vast, maybe 8,000 square feet under a ceiling supported by iron beams Raymond himself had probably forged. Broken windows let in morning light that illuminated dust dancing in the air, settled over workbenches and equipment that looked like artifacts from another era. The forge itself dominated one corner, a massive brick structure that had once burned hot enough to melt iron. The bellows system was still intact, the anvils still bolted to their stands, tools still hanging on walls in organized rows. It looked like Raymond had simply walked away leaving everything in place as if he might return tomorrow. Sophie appeared with her backpack, dressed for school in clothes they'd washed in a creek that ran through the property. "Is my school close?" she asked. Connor nodded. 20 minutes. I'll drive you. Pick you up after. We'll spend the day figuring out what needs fixing first. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive into Ashland Ridge took them past properties that showed varying degrees of care. Some houses were maintained, lawns mowed, paint fresh. Others sagged with the same decay that affected the foundry, victims of an economy that had moved on and left people behind. The school was a brick building that looked like it hadn't changed since Connor had attended summer sessions here as a kid during those visits to Raymond's foundry. The principal, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Davidson, processed Sophie's enrollment with the kind of efficiency that suggested she was used to kids appearing mid-semester. "You're Raymond Hayes' nephew," she said, not quite a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Heard you'd come back for the foundry. That place has been empty a long time." Her expression was neutral, but Connor sensed evaluation happening beneath the surface. "Lot of history there. My uncle ran a good operation." "He did, until things got complicated." Mrs. Davidson handed Connor a packet of forms. "Welcome back to Ashland Ridge, Mr. Hayes. Sophie will be in Mrs. Patterson's class. We'll take good care of her." After dropping Sophie at school, Connor drove back to the foundry, taking the long route through town. Ashland Ridge hadn't changed much in 15 years. The same diner, the same hardware store, the same bank on the corner of Main and Oak. But there were empty storefronts now, businesses that had closed and never been replaced. A pattern Connor recognized from other small towns he'd seen, places where the economy was a slow leak that nobody quite knew how to patch. The foundry sat on what would be valuable land if Ashland Ridge ever grew again. 3 acres with road access and proximity to the town center. Connor had seen the real estate listings while researching before coming here. Properties like this, if developed, could be worth substantial money to the right buyer. Empty industrial land that could be converted to housing or retail, scraped clean of history and rebuilt for profit. He spent the morning documenting what Raymond had left behind, taking inventory of tools and equipment, trying to assess what might have value versus what was just scrap metal. The forge itself was remarkable, built to last centuries, its brickwork solid despite years of neglect. The bellows system needed leather replacement but was mechanically sound. If someone wanted to operate a traditional forge again, this one could be brought back to life. Around noon, a truck pulled into the gravel lot, newer and cleaner than Connor's. A man got out, maybe 60, wearing work clothes that had seen actual work. He approached carefully, hands visible, the posture of someone used to dealing with potentially hostile situations. "You Connor Hayes?" the man called. "I am." "Figured. You look like Raymond did at your age." The man extended his hand as Connor approached. "Name's Bill Thornton. Worked with your uncle for 20 years before the Foundry closed. Heard you were back." They shook, Bill's grip firm and calloused. "Wanted to see if you needed any help getting the place sorted. Raymond was a good man, good boss. Felt wrong not to at least offer." Connor studied Bill's face, looking for hidden agendas or ulterior motives, and finding only what appeared to be genuine respect for his uncle. "You know who might want me gone?" Bill's expression darkened. "Got a visit already, did you?" "Rocks through the window at 3 a.m. Note said leave or it gets worse." "Damn." Bill shook his head. "Same crew that tried to pressure Raymond in his last years. There's a development company that's been buying up land around here. Wants to tear down the old industrial buildings and put in housing. Your uncle refused to sell. Said the Foundry was heritage that mattered. They made his life difficult toward the end." "How difficult?" "Equipment vandalized, contracts mysteriously canceled, suppliers suddenly unable to deliver materials. Nothing you could prove, just constant pressure until Raymond finally shut down. He never sold, though. Held on to the property out of pure stubbornness." Bill paused. "When he died, I figured they'd buy it from the estate. But apparently he'd made sure it went to family. That would be you." Connor looked at the Foundry, seeing it differently now. Not just an abandoned building, but a battleground where his uncle had fought to preserve something he believed mattered. "Who runs this development company?" "Family, named Garrett. Been in Ashland Ridge for generations. Made money in coal and real estate. Thomas Garrett runs things now. His son Blake handles the day-to-day. They're persistent, and they don't like losing." Bill met Connor's eyes. "They might try to buy you out first, make a decent offer. But if you refuse like Raymond did, they'll make things unpleasant." "I don't have anywhere else to go," Connor said honestly. "And I don't respond well to threats." Bill smiled slightly. "Yeah, Raymond said you'd gone Army. Combat engineer?" 15 years. Just finished my last deployment 6 months ago." "Well, that'll help if things get rough. But be careful, Connor. The Garretts have money and connections. Raymond didn't have family to worry about, could dig in his heels. You've got a daughter to think about." After Bill left, Connor walked the property's perimeter, seeing it with new understanding. The Foundry sat on a slight rise, visible from the road, prime location for development. The surrounding properties were mostly empty industrial buildings or vacant lots, exactly the kind of area developers loved to transform. If the Garretts could acquire enough contiguous land, they could build something substantial. The Foundry was probably the keystone property, the piece they needed to make the whole project work, which meant they'd be motivated to acquire it, one way or another. Connor found himself thinking about Raymond's note. Don't let them take it. Not a request to keep the Foundry for sentimental reasons, but a warning that someone would try. His uncle had fought this battle alone and held his ground until death. Now that ground was Connor's, along with whatever fight came with it. He spent the afternoon making the Foundry more secure, reinforcing the door locks they'd been using, boarding up ground floor windows that weren't essential, creating sight lines that would make it harder for someone to approach without being seen. Old habits from deployment, making defensive positions out of whatever materials were available. When he picked up Sophie from school, she was quiet, the kind of silence that meant something had happened. Connor waited until they were back at the Foundry, heating soup on the camping stove before asking, "How was school?" "Fine," Sophie said, not meeting his eyes. "Sophie?" She set down her spoon. "Some kids said the Foundry is cursed, that bad things happen to people who stay here, that your uncle died because he wouldn't leave." She finally looked at him. "Is that true?" Connor chose his words carefully. "My uncle died of a heart attack. That happens to people sometimes, no curse required. And yes, some people want this property, but wanting something isn't the same as having the right to take it." "But the rocks through the window were meant to scare us. But we don't scare easy, do we?" Sophie managed a small smile. "No, army families don't scare easy." That night, Connor couldn't sleep. He lay in the makeshift bed they'd created, listening to Sophie breathe beside him, thinking about Bill's warning and Raymond's last message, and the fact that he'd come here with almost nothing and now owned something people apparently wanted badly enough to throw rocks through windows at 3 in the morning. Around midnight, he heard a sound outside. Not the obvious approach of a truck, but something quieter. Movement in the gravel lot. He slipped out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and moved to the window they'd been using to watch the property. A figure stood near the Foundry's main entrance, barely visible in the darkness. Not moving, just standing there, watching the building. Connor's combat instincts kicked in, his heart rate steady, his mind automatically cataloging details. One person, average height, hands at their sides. Not an immediate threat, but definitely surveillance. Connor turned on the flashlight, pointing it directly at the figure. For a moment they stood frozen in the beam, and Connor saw. It was a young man, maybe early 20s, wearing a jacket with a logo he couldn't quite make out. Then the figure turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness beyond the Foundry's property line. Connor stood at the window for another hour, flashlight ready, but nobody returned. When he finally went back to bed, he knew sleep wouldn't come. The message was clear. Someone was watching. Someone wanted to know if the rocks had worked, if the newcomer would be easily intimidated. By morning, Connor had made his decision. He'd fought for 15 years in places where the threats were foreign and abstract. But this Foundry, this broken-down building his uncle had died protecting, this was something real, something worth standing ground for, not because it was valuable, but because Raymond had believed it mattered. Because giving in to threats meant teaching Sophie that intimidation worked, that you surrendered what was yours when someone decided to take it. He made breakfast while Sophie got ready for school, his mind already planning the day ahead. First, he'd contact the lawyer handling Raymond's estate, make sure the property transfer was proceeding correctly. Then, he'd talk to local authorities about the harassment, get it on record, even if he didn't expect much help. Finally, he'd start bringing the Foundry back to life, make it clear he wasn't leaving, wasn't intimidated, wasn't going to make this easy for whoever wanted him gone. As he drove Sophie to school through the cold November morning, passing properties that remembered better days, Connor felt something he hadn't felt in months. Purpose. The Foundry needed someone to fight for it, and fighting was something he knew how to do. What he didn't know yet was just how far the Garretts were willing to go, or what secrets Raymond had kept about why this particular Foundry mattered so much that dying was preferable to surrendering it. Those answers were waiting in the building's shadows, in its locked rooms and hidden spaces, in the legacy Raymond had left behind for the nephew he'd never contacted but had trusted with everything. The Foundry held secrets deeper than anyone realized, and Connor was about to discover that some inheritances came with obligations that extended far beyond property lines. The lawyer's office was in a converted house on Main Street, its sign barely visible behind overgrown shrubs that nobody had trimmed in months. Patricia Wells looked older than her voice had sounded on the phone, maybe 70, with the kind of precise organization that came from decades of small-town legal work. She spread Raymond's will and property documents across her desk with careful hands, each paper positioned exactly where it needed to be. "Your uncle was very specific about his wishes," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd known Raymond personally. "The Foundry goes to you, no conditions except that you can't sell it for 5 years from the date of transfer. After that, it's yours to do with as you please." Connor leaned forward. "Why the 5-year restriction?" Raymond believed that if you committed to keeping it that long, you'd understand why it mattered. If you still wanted to sell after 5 years, he respected that choice. Patricia adjusted her glasses. "He also left a letter for you. I was instructed to give it to you only after you'd spent at least 1 week at the property." She pulled an envelope from her desk drawer, Raymond's handwriting across the front. "Connor James Hayes," it read. "To be opened when ready." Connor took it, feeling the weight of paper that held his uncle's final words. "There's something else you should know," Patricia continued, her expression growing more serious. "Raymond filed several police reports in his last 2 years. Harassment, vandalism, what he called systematic attempts to force him off his property. The local sheriff's department investigated but could never find enough evidence to make charges." "Stick. Who was he accusing?" "He never named anyone directly in the reports, but everyone in Ashland Ridge knew he was talking about Garrett Development. They'd made him several offers over the years, each one higher than the last. Raymond refused every time." Connor thought about the rocks through the window, the figure watching in the darkness. Why did they want it so badly? It's just an old foundry. Patricia's pause was deliberate, as if she was weighing how much to say. Raymond believed there was something more to it. He spent his last year doing research, talking to old-timers who remembered the foundry's early days. He never told me what he found, but he was convinced the land itself had value beyond its development potential. After leaving Patricia's office, Connor drove to the sheriff's department, a small building that shared space with the town's volunteer fire department. The deputy who took his report about the rocks and the surveillance was young, professional, and clearly uninterested. He wrote down the details, promised they'd increase patrols, and managed to convey without saying it directly that nothing would come of this. "Your uncle filed a lot of reports," the deputy said as Connor was leaving. "We investigated every one. Never found evidence that would hold up in court. So I'm on my own." The deputy's expression acknowledged the truth without confirming it. "Document everything. Cameras if you can afford them. But Ashland Ridge is a small town, Mr. Hayes. People have long memories and complicated loyalties." Connor picked up Sophie from school, her face troubled in a way that made his chest tight. She waited until they were away from the building before speaking. "A man came to my class today. He said he was from the county checking on new students. He asked me questions about where we lived, whether we liked it at the Foundry." Connor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What did you tell him?" "That it was fine. That you were fixing it up." Sophie turned to look at him. But Mrs. Patterson looked really uncomfortable, like she knew something was wrong but didn't know what to do about it. "Did this man give a name?" "Mr. Garrett. He was really polite, but something about him felt wrong, like he was being nice but didn't mean it." Connor's jaw clenched. They were targeting Sophie now, letting him know his daughter wasn't off limits. It was a calculated move, designed to make him understand that staying meant putting her at risk. He drove straight back to the school, found the principal, and made it clear that no one from any county office should be speaking to his daughter without his explicit permission and presence. Mrs. Davidson's expression confirmed what he'd suspected. "Blake Garrett does contract work for the county sometimes. He probably used that as his excuse to access the school. I should have verified before allowing him near students. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes." That evening, Connor sat Sophie down in the space they'd made livable, the camping stove warming the room against November cold. I need to tell you what's happening, because you're old enough to understand, and you deserve to know the truth. He explained about the development company, about Raymond's refusal to sell, about the pressure and harassment that had defined his uncle's last years. Sophie listened with the serious attention she'd learned from being a military kid, processing information that would have overwhelmed other 11-year-olds. So they want to scare us away, she said when he finished. Yes. But we're not going anywhere. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. If we stay, if we fight this, it might get harder before it gets better. I can handle that. But I need to know if you can too, because if you can't, if this is too much, we'll find another way. I won't let defending this place hurt you. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her face thoughtful in the dim light. Finally, she said, Mom left because things got hard. She said she couldn't handle the stress of military life, of never knowing where we'd be or if you'd come back from deployment. She chose the easy path. Connor started to respond, but Sophie continued. You taught me that easy paths don't always lead somewhere worth going, that sometimes you have to stand for things even when it's hard. She met his eyes. Uncle Raymond stood for something, and now it's ours to stand for. I can handle hard, Dad. I've been handling it my whole life. Pride and heartbreak mixed in Connor's chest so thoroughly he couldn't separate them. His daughter had inherited his stubbornness and her mother's clarity, a combination that would either save her or break her, depending on what life threw at them. That night, Connor opened Raymond's letter. The handwriting was shaky, written by a man who knew his time was limited. It began without preamble. Connor, if you're reading this, you came back. I wasn't sure you would after how I failed you when your mother died. I should have taken you in, should have been family when you needed it most. I was a coward, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm asking you now to do what I did. Stand for something that matters, even when everyone tells you to quit. The Foundry sits on land that was deeded to our family in 1889. Your great-great-grandfather won it in a card game from a man named Silas Garrett, ancestor of the family that's been trying to take it back for over a century. The original deed included mineral rights to the property and 3 acres extending west to the creek. Those rights were standard for the time, mostly worthless. Except they're not worthless. In 1947, a geological survey team came through doing assessment for the state. They took core samples, filed reports that never became public. I found those reports last year in county archives that were being digitized. Connor, there's a significant deposit of rare earth elements under this property. The kind used in electronics, batteries, modern technology. The kind that's worth millions, maybe tens of millions if extracted properly. The Garretts know. They've known since the 1940s, which is why they've been trying to buy this land for 3 generations. But they can't just take it. The deed is solid, and mineral rights transfer with the property. So they've tried pressure, tried waiting for us to die out, tried making life difficult enough that we'd sell just for peace. I didn't sell because this land was won fairly, and our family kept it through honest work. Because giving in to bullies just because they have money and influence is how good people lose everything that matters. I held them off as long as I could, but I'm 68 and tired, and my heart isn't what it was. Now it's your fight if you choose to take it. I won't judge you for selling. You've got a daughter to think about, and I never had to balance principle against protecting a child. But if you stay, if you stand your ground, you'll be finishing something that started over a century ago. Either way, you deserved to know the truth about what you inherited. Your uncle, Raymond Connor, read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new implications. The harassment wasn't about development pressure or prime real estate. It was about mineral rights worth enough money that people would wait generations to acquire them, would systematically destroy a man's livelihood to force a sale, would target a child to pressure her father into surrendering what was rightfully his. He spent the next day in the county records office, finding the same geological reports Raymond had mentioned. The language was technical, but the conclusion was clear. The deposit beneath the Foundry property wasn't huge by industrial mining standards, but rare earth elements were valuable enough that even a modest deposit represented significant wealth. Current market prices put the potential value somewhere between $15 and $30 million. That evening, Blake Garrett came to the Foundry. He arrived in a new truck, wearing clothes that were meant to look working class but were too clean, too pressed. He knocked on the door Connor had reinforced, his posture suggesting friendly visit rather than confrontation. Connor met him outside, keeping the door closed behind him, keeping Sophie inside where she couldn't be used as leverage in whatever conversation was about to happen. "Mr. Hayes," Blake said, extending his hand. "Blake Garrett. I think we should talk." Connor didn't take the offered hand. "You talked to my daughter at her school. That's not how conversations start in my world." Blake lowered his hand, his friendly expression flickering slightly. "That was a misunderstanding. I'm on the county development board, was doing routine checks on new enrollments. I didn't realize it would cause concern. You knew exactly what you were doing. Let's not insult each other's intelligence." Something harder showed in Blake's eyes, the real person beneath the affable exterior. "Fine, direct then. You're sitting on property my family has been trying to acquire for a long time. Your uncle was stubborn, made it personal, refused reasonable offers. I'm hoping you'll be more practical." "Practical meaning I should sell because you want to buy?" "Practical meaning you should recognize when you're out of your depth. You're a veteran with a kid, probably living on whatever discharge pay you saved, camping in a building that's not fit for habitation. I'm offering you a way out that leaves you with substantial money and no more problems." Blake pulled a folded paper from his pocket. $2 million for the property, mineral rights included. Transfer happens within 30 days. You walk away wealthy enough to start fresh anywhere you want. Connor took the paper but didn't unfold it. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll discover what your uncle discovered, that life in Ashland Ridge can be very difficult for people who don't cooperate with community progress. Permits get delayed, utilities have mysterious problems, local businesses stop serving troublemakers. Your daughter's school experience becomes complicated." "You're threatening a child." "I'm explaining reality." Blake's voice hardened. "My family has been part of this community for 6 generations. We employ half the people in Ashland Ridge, sit on every board that matters, know everyone worth knowing. You're an outsider who showed up with nothing. How do you think that fight ends?" Connor stepped closer, his combat training giving him a presence that made Blake take an involuntary step back. "In my experience, fights end when someone decides the cost isn't worth the prize. I've got nothing to lose and a foundry that's legally mine. You've got a reputation and a family name that could be damaged if certain geological surveys became public knowledge. If people knew you've been systematically harassing property owners over mineral rights you have no legal claim to." Blake's expression went cold. "You don't want to make an enemy of me." "I already have. You threw rocks through my daughter's window and stalked us in the dark. We're past the point where we might have been friends." Connor held up the offer. but I'll consider this. Give me 72 hours to think about it. After Blake left, Connor stood in the gravel lot watching taillights disappear, knowing he'd just escalated a conflict that had been simmering for generations. The smart play was probably to take the money, to recognize when you were outmatched and out-resourced. $2 million would change everything for him and Sophie, would give them security he couldn't provide any other way. But Raymond's letter sat in his pocket like a stone, and his daughter was inside a building his family had owned for over a century, and Connor had spent 15 years learning that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were terrible. He went inside and found Sophie reading by flashlight, her homework spread across the makeshift table they'd created from sawhorses and plywood. She looked up as he entered, reading something in his expression. "They made an offer," she said. "They did. A lot of money. But you're not taking it." Connor sat beside her, choosing honesty over false comfort. "I don't want to. But I might have to, if staying means putting you in real danger. The Garretts have resources and connections. They can make our lives very difficult." Sophie set down her book, her face serious. "When you were deployed, when things were scary and you didn't know if you'd make it home, did you quit?" "That was different. That was my job, my choice. But this is your choice too, and mine. We can choose to stand for something, or choose to run because someone threatened us." She paused. "Mom chose to run. I don't want to be like her." The words hit Connor hard, revealing how much his daughter had processed about her mother's abandonment, how she'd shaped it into a lesson about character and courage. He pulled her into a hug, feeling her small frame against his chest, her heart beating steady and determined. "Okay," he said. "We stay. But we do it smart, not stubborn. We document everything. We make noise if we need to. And we don't take stupid risks." Over the next 2 days, Connor began implementing defensive measures that drew on his military training. He installed motion sensor lights around the Foundry's perimeter, purchased a security camera system with his remaining savings, documented every interaction with the Garretts and their associates. He also started exploring the Foundry more systematically, searching for whatever else Raymond might have left behind. In a locked office on the second floor, he found his uncle's personal files, detailed records of every Garrett attempt to acquire the property going back to 1947. Photographs of vandalism, copies of harassment complaints. A meticulous timeline that showed how the family had systematically pressured every Hayes who'd owned the Foundry, waiting for death or desperation to create selling opportunities. He also found something else. A map of the property with specific locations marked, and notes in Raymond's handwriting about test samples taken at those points. His uncle had done his own amateur geological assessment, confirming what the 1947 survey had found. The rare earth deposit was real, was substantial, and was entirely on Hayes family land. On the third day, Connor received a visit from Thomas Garrett himself, Blake's father, the patriarch who'd been fighting this battle for decades. He arrived in a different kind of truck, older and more worn, and his approach was more grandfather than businessman. "Your uncle was a good man," Thomas said after Connor agreed to talk with him in the Foundry's yard. "Stubborn, but good. We had our disagreements, but I respected him. Respected him enough to vandalize his property?" Thomas's expression didn't change. "I never authorized that. Blake sometimes forgets that pressure tactics can create more problems than they solve." He paused, looking at the Foundry with what seemed like genuine appreciation. "This building represents something important. Craftsmanship, tradition, a time when making things with your hands mattered. I understand why Raymond fought to keep it. But you still want him gone. I want the land it sits on. There's a difference." Thomas met Connor's eyes. I'll be honest with you in a way I never was with Raymond. This isn't about development or progress. It's about correcting an injustice from 1889, when my great-great-grandfather lost this land in a card game he was cheated in. Your ancestor marked the deck, stole what should have been Garrett property. Connor felt the ground shift beneath this conversation, understanding that he'd stepped into something that went deeper than money. You have proof of that? Family, history, letters. Nothing that would hold up in court after all this time, but enough to know the truth. The mineral rights should have been ours. The wealth beneath this ground should have built Garrett's legacy, not Hayes. I'm offering you a chance to correct history, to take money for something your family stole, and walk away honorably. Or what? You'll do to me what you did to Raymond? Drive me out through harassment and threats? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried genuine weariness. I'm 74 years old, Mr. Hayes. I've spent my entire adult life trying to recover what my family lost. I've watched your uncle die here, stubborn to the end, protecting a building he barely used anymore out of pure spite. I don't want to watch you do the same thing. Take the offer. Build a good life for your daughter somewhere else. Let an old man correct a wrong before he runs out of time. There was something almost sympathetic in Thomas's appeal, a recognition that they were both prisoners of history neither had created. But Connor thought about Raymond's letter, about Sophie's determination, about the fact that whether the 1889 card game was honest or not, his family had held this land legally for over a century. I need to think about it, Connor said finally. Thomas nodded, accepting this. Blake gave you 72 hours. That ends tomorrow. After that, I can't control what he does. My son doesn't have my patience, and he's tired of waiting for what he believes is rightfully his. He started walking back to his truck, then paused. Your uncle told me once that some battles aren't worth dying for. I disagreed with him then, but now I wonder if he was right. Think about that, Mr. Hayes. Think about what you're really fighting for, and whether it's worth what it might cost. That night, Connor couldn't sleep. He lay beside Sophie in their makeshift bedroom, listening to her breathe, thinking about everything that had led them here. His failed marriage, his military service, his mother's death, and Raymond's absence, the chain of events that had brought him back to this foundry with his daughter and nothing else. Around midnight he heard vehicles approaching. Not one truck, but several, moving slowly, deliberately. He slipped out of bed, grabbed his phone, and moved to the window. 4 trucks had pulled into the gravel lot, their headlights off, using only parking lights. Men got out, maybe a dozen of them, carrying tools that glinted in the moonlight. Not weapons, exactly, but close enough. Sledgehammers and crowbars, the kinds of things used for demolition or intimidation. Connor's combat instincts took over, his heart rate steady even as adrenaline flooded his system. He had seconds to make a decision. Wake Sophie and get her out, or try to de-escalate before this became violence. The security cameras were recording, which meant whatever happened next would be documented. He made his choice, stepping out the door before the men could approach the building, positioning himself between them and Sophie, his phone held up and obviously recording. That's far enough, he called, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years ordering soldiers in combat zones. You're on private property. You're being recorded, and the sheriff's department has been notified. The men stopped, uncertain, looking to someone in the back who stepped forward into better light. Blake Garrett, not wearing his friendly face anymore. Time's up, Hayes. You had your chance to do this the easy way. Connor kept recording, kept his voice level. You're about to commit felony trespassing and destruction of property on camera. Think carefully about your next move. Who's going to prosecute? My family owns this county. Maybe. But veterans advocacy groups love stories about combat vets being harassed by corrupt local developers. So do national news outlets. This video gets uploaded to the cloud automatically. Anything happens to me or my daughter, it goes public. You ready for that kind of attention? Blake's expression showed he hadn't expected resistance, hadn't anticipated Connor being prepared for this escalation. He stood there in the November cold, surrounded by men who'd been paid or pressured into joining this midnight visit, facing a veteran who'd handled worse situations in worse places. Finally, Blake stepped back. This isn't over. I know, Connor said, but it's not ending tonight with you demolishing my property while my daughter sleeps inside. You want this land? You'll have to find a legal way to take it. The trucks left, their departure slower and less confident than their arrival. Connor stood in the gravel lot long after the taillights disappeared, his phone still recording, his hands shaking slightly now that the immediate threat had passed. Inside, he found Sophie awake, sitting up in bed, her face pale. She'd heard everything. "You should have woken me," she said. "I handled it. But what if you couldn't have? What if they'd—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Connor sat beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders. Then the recording would have shown what happened, and they'd have faced consequences. But it didn't come to that. They backed down because they realized I was prepared. Are we safe? It was the question Connor had been avoiding, the one he couldn't answer honestly without admitting they were in deeper than he'd anticipated. For tonight, yes. Tomorrow, we figure out next steps. But as he lay awake the rest of the night listening for approaching vehicles, Connor knew that the battle for the Foundry had entered a new phase. The Garretts had moved from harassment to direct confrontation, and next time they might not back down when faced with a recording device and threats of publicity. He'd won tonight's confrontation, but winning a battle wasn't the same as winning a war, especially when your enemy had resources and patience measured in generations. The Foundry's secrets had drawn him into a conflict that stretched back over a century, and Connor was beginning to understand that some inheritances came with obligations that couldn't be walked away from, no matter how sensible retreat might seem. The video went viral within 48 hours, though Connor hadn't intended it to. He'd sent copies to the sheriff's department, to Patricia Wells, and to a veterans advocacy organization he'd worked with during his transition out of the Army. Someone in that organization had connections with a regional news outlet, and by the time Connor realized what was happening, the footage of Blake Garrett confronting a veteran and his daughter in the middle of the night had been picked up by state media, then national. The story wrote itself. Single father, combat veteran, protecting his late uncle's property from wealthy developers with a history of harassment. The fact that Connor had documented everything, that Raymond's complaints were part of public record, that the Garretts' attempts to acquire the property stretched back decades, it all created a narrative that news outlets loved and audiences consumed with righteous anger. Connor watched it unfold from the Foundry, his phone buzzing constantly with interview requests and messages of support. The attention was uncomfortable, exposed them in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it also provided protection. The Garretts couldn't make them disappear when thousands of people were watching. Thomas Garrett called on the third day after the video went public, his voice carrying exhaustion rather than anger. "You've made this very complicated, Mr. Hayes. I documented harassment. The complications are yours, not mine. My son acted without my approval. The men he brought were contractors who owed him favors, didn't know what they were walking into. Blake has always been too eager, too willing to push boundaries I wouldn't cross. Thomas paused. I'm calling to apologize and to withdraw our offer. The attention you've generated makes further pressure impossible, and frankly, I'm too old to keep fighting battles my great-great-grandfather started. Connor felt surprise at the capitulation, had expected the Garretts to lawyer up and fight back. Just like that? Blake sees it differently. He believes we should sue you for defamation, claim the video was staged, fight this through the courts for years. But I've spent my life watching this obsession poison my family. My father died angry, never having recovered what he believed was stolen. I don't want to die the same way, and I don't want to burden my son with another generation of this fight. Thomas's voice dropped lower. Keep the Foundry. Keep the mineral rights. Build something good there, or sell them to someone who will. Either way, the Garretts are done pursuing this. After hanging up, Connor sat in the office that had been Raymond's, surrounded by his uncles. Meticulous documentation of a conflict that had defined decades. He thought about Thomas Garrett's weariness, about the poison of inherited grudges, about the fact that the card game in 1889 had created ripples that were still disturbing water over a century later. Sophie found him there an hour later, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her face showing the careful neutrality she wore when things at school had been difficult. Kids were talking about the video today. Some of them think we're heroes. Others think we're troublemakers who should have taken the money and left. Which do you think? She considered the question seriously. I think we're just people who didn't want to be pushed around. That's not heroic, it's just normal. But I guess normal looks different when someone's trying to take what's yours. Connor pulled her into a hug, feeling her lean against him with the trust that still amazed him after everything they'd been through. You holding up okay? Better than at other schools. At least here, people know why we're fighting. On bases, we were just another family that moved too much. She pulled back, meeting his eyes. Are we staying, now that they've given up? It was the question Connor had been asking himself since Thomas Garrett's call. The immediate threat had passed, but the Foundry was still a building in advanced decay, still required massive investment to make truly livable, still represented a life tied to Ashland Ridge in ways Connor hadn't planned for when he'd left the Army. I don't know yet, he admitted, but we've got time to figure it out. Over the following weeks, the attention from the video brought unexpected consequences. A nonprofit focused on preserving industrial heritage reached out, interested in the Foundry's historical significance and Raymond's traditional metalworking techniques. They had grant money available for restoration projects, could connect Connor with craftspeople who understood old forges and iron equipment. The documentary filmmaker contacted him, wanting to tell the story of small-town conflicts over development and heritage, using the Foundry as a case study. The potential payment would be enough to fund serious renovation work. Local people started stopping by, some to offer support, others to share their own stories of Garrett pressure over the years. Connor learned that Raymond hadn't been their only target, just their most stubborn holdout. Other families had sold under similar circumstances, taken money, and left Ashland Ridge carrying resentment that had never healed. Bill Thornton became a regular presence, helping Connor assess what equipment could be salvaged and what needed replacement. They worked in companionable silence most days, the kind that existed between men who understood each other without needing constant conversation. Your uncle taught me everything I know about metalwork, Bill said one afternoon while they were cataloging the forge's components. He believed in doing things the right way, even when shortcuts would have been easier. Lost him contracts sometimes, but he never compromised. That stubbornness got him killed, Connor said, thinking of Raymond dying alone in this building, his heart giving out while he was still fighting battles that had started before he was born. Maybe. Or maybe it gave his life meaning. Bill set down the tool he'd been examining. Not everyone gets to die defending something they believe in. most of us just fade away, having never stood for anything that mattered. Raymond chose different. And now, you're standing on ground he held because he believed it was worth the cost. The words stayed with Connor as winter deepened and the Foundry slowly transformed from emergency shelter to something approaching home. They installed proper heating, fixed the roof completely, replaced windows with insulated units that kept the cold out. Sophie's bedroom had walls and a door now, her own space that felt permanent rather than temporary. The grants came through in February, enough money to begin serious restoration work on the forge itself. Connor hired Bill full-time the project, bringing in craftspeople who understood historical metalworking equipment. The work was slow and exacting, but watching the forge come back to life felt like honoring Raymond in ways words couldn't capture. Sophie flourished in ways that surprised Connor. She'd made friends at school, kids who accepted her for who she was rather than judging her for having a father who'd made local news. She started spending time in the forge after school, watching Bill work, asking questions that showed genuine interest in the craft. "Would Uncle Raymond have taught me?" she asked one evening while they ate dinner in the kitchen Connor had built in what used to be a storage area. Probably. He taught anyone who wanted to learn, according to Bill. Didn't matter if you were family or not, as long as you respected the craft. "I want to learn," Sophie said, "not because of the metal or the history, but because it connects to you and to him and to this place. Like learning a language that only certain people speak." Connor felt something shift in his chest, recognition that his daughter was choosing to root herself here in ways he'd been resisting. She was building connections to Ashland Ridge, to the Foundry, to a legacy that had been thrust upon them, but that she was actively claiming as her own. In March, Patricia Wells called with news that the mineral rights evaluation had been completed by a firm hired through the Heritage nonprofit. The deposit was confirmed, was substantial, and could be licensed to an ethical extraction company that specialized in minimally invasive rare earth recovery. The potential income would be significant, steady, and long-term. You could be looking at $600,000 to $800,000 per year for the next 15 to 20 years, Patricia said. More than enough to restore the Foundry completely and live comfortably while doing it. Or you could sell the rights outright for a lump sum, though I wouldn't recommend that. Connor sat with the information for several days before discussing it with Sophie. They walked the property together, following the creek that formed the western boundary, looking at land that had been fought over for generations because of what it held beneath the surface. "The money would change everything," Sophie said, understanding the implications immediately. "We could fix up the Foundry completely, maybe even start operating it again like Uncle Raymond did. Hire people, teach the craft, keep something alive that's disappearing. We could also take the money and leave. Start over somewhere new without all the history and conflict." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, watching water move over rocks that had been there longer than any human claim to this land. "When Mom left, she said she was choosing herself over us. That she needed to find peace, and we were too complicated." She turned to look at Connor. "I think that's what leaving would be. Choosing easy over complicated, peace over purpose. And I don't want to be like her." The simplicity of it, the clarity, made Connor recognize something he'd been avoiding. They hadn't stumbled into this situation by accident. Raymond had left him the Foundry knowing what it would mean, knowing the fight it would require, trusting that his nephew had the stubbornness to stand ground that needed standing. This was inheritance in its truest form, not just property but obligation, not just rights but responsibility. "Okay," Connor said. "We stay. We restore this place and we do it right. We honor what Raymond protected and we build something worth protecting for whoever comes after us." Sophie smiled, The kind of smile that made her look like her mother in the good years, before everything had gotten hard. I'm glad. This place feels like home in ways nowhere else ever has. The restoration accelerated through spring and summer. The forge was brought back to full operational status, its fire lit for the first time in 15 years during a small ceremony that Bill insisted on. Local craftspeople came, some who'd worked with Raymond, others who just wanted to witness traditional metalworking equipment coming back to life. Connor learned to work the forge under Bill's patient instruction, discovering that metal responded to heat and pressure in ways that were almost meditative. Sophie learned, too, her smaller hands surprisingly deft at precision work. They created simple pieces at first, hooks and hinges, basic items that taught fundamental techniques, but the act of making something from raw material felt significant in ways Connor hadn't expected. The licensing agreement for the mineral rights came through in August, contracts that guaranteed income while protecting the land from destructive extraction practices. The first payment arrived in September. More money than Connor had ever seen in his account, representing security he'd never experienced as an adult. He used it carefully, investing in the Foundry's continued restoration, establishing funds for Sophie's education, setting aside reserves for unexpected problems. But he also donated to the veterans organization that had helped publicize his situation, and to a fund Patricia Wells administered that helped other Ashland Ridge families fight unfair development pressure. Blake Garrett left town that fall, taking a job with a development firm in another state. Thomas Garrett sold most of his local holdings, retired from active business, and spent his remaining time with his grandchildren. Connor saw him occasionally in town, and they'd nod to each other with the complicated respect of former enemies who'd both survived the fight. On a cool October evening, 1 year after Connor had arrived at the Foundry with Sophie and nothing else, they held a grand reopening. The building was transformed, restored but not modernized, its industrial character preserved while being made fully functional. The forge operated again, taking commissions for custom metalwork from historical societies and private clients who valued traditional craftsmanship. But more than that, the Foundry had become a teaching facility, a place where people could learn skills that were disappearing from the modern world. Bill ran daily workshops, Sophie assisted on weekends, and Connor managed the business side while continuing his own training as a metalworker. The event drew people from across Kentucky, craftspeople and preservationists, former Raymond employees, and curious locals. They toured the restored spaces, watched demonstrations at the forge, and examined pieces Connor and Sophie had made, simple items, but growing in complexity as their skills developed. Bill gave a speech about Raymond, about a man who'd dedicated his life to craft and principle, who'd held ground against forces that wanted to erase history for profit. Raymond believed that keeping old skills alive mattered, Bill said, his voice carrying across the Foundry floor. Not because the past was better, but because understanding how things were made teaches us something about who we are. This building stands today because Raymond stood for that belief, and because his nephew had the courage to carry it forward. As people mingled and explored, Connor found himself standing in the spot where he'd first entered the Foundry with Sophie, looking at the transformation they'd achieved. The building breathed differently now, alive with purpose and activity, the smell of metal and coal smoke mixing with the scent of people and conversation. Patricia Wells approached, her expression showing satisfaction at seeing Raymond's legacy preserved. "Your uncle would be proud," she said, "not just of the restoration, but of the choice you made to stay and fight. He spent his whole life wondering if anyone else would understand why this mattered." "I almost didn't," Connor admitted. "Almost took the money and left. But you didn't. That's what matters." She paused, then handed him an envelope. "Raymond left one more thing for you. I was instructed to give it to you only after the Foundry was operational again." Inside was a short letter in Raymond's shaky handwriting, dated 2 days before his death. Connor, if you're reading this, you did it. You fought and you won, and the Foundry lives again. I'm proud of you in ways I never managed to express while alive. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed family. Sorry I let fear of failure keep me from being the uncle you deserved. But I'm grateful you found your way back here. Grateful you had the strength I sometimes lacked. The Foundry is yours now, truly yours, in ways that go beyond legal ownership. You've earned it through standing ground that needed standing, through teaching your daughter that some things are worth the cost of defending them. That's the real inheritance, not property or mineral rights, but the understanding that legacy is something you build rather than something you receive. Make something good here. Teach others what I taught you in those childhood summers. Pass forward the knowledge that metal responds to patient work, that heat and pressure can transform raw material into something useful and beautiful. That's what this building has always been about. Transformation and patience and the stubborn belief that craft matters. I died protecting this place, but I died satisfied knowing it would find its way to someone who understood. Thank you for proving me right. Your uncle, Raymond Connor. Read the letter twice, then showed it to Sophie. She read it carefully, her expression thoughtful, then looked around at the Foundry full of people celebrating what they'd built. He knew, she said. He knew we'd do this. Or he hoped. Sometimes that's the same thing. They stood together watching people move through the space, hearing the forge's fire crackling in its brick housing, smelling the coal smoke that had scented this building for over a century. The Foundry had stood through generations of conflict, had survived abandonment and return, had held secrets and surface truths in equal measure. Connor thought about the card game in 1889, about whether his ancestor had cheated or won fairly, about whether it mattered after so much time and consequence. The truth was probably lost to history, complicated by the fact that both families believed their own version with equal conviction. What mattered was what he chose to do with the inheritance he'd received. Not just property, but purpose. Not just rights, but responsibility to something larger than himself. The Foundry would stand because he'd chosen to let it stand, because Sophie had chosen to root herself here, because sometimes the harder path led somewhere worth going. As evening settled over Ashland Ridge and the celebration continued, Connor felt something he hadn't felt since before Melissa left, since before his last deployment, since before his mother died and Raymond had failed to step forward. Not happiness, exactly, because life was too complicated for simple emotions, but belonging. The sense that this place, this broken building his uncle had died protecting, had become home in ways that transcended convenience or comfort. Sophie was talking with Bill about a commission they'd received, her enthusiasm evident in animated gestures that reminded Connor of his mother, of family traits that persisted across generations. She'd found purpose here, connection to craft and legacy that would shape who she became. The Foundry breathed in the evening air, its walls holding stories it would continue to hold, its structure proof that what was worth defending could be defended, that legacy was built through choice and commitment rather than received through accident of birth. Raymond's sacrifice had bought time for Connor to arrive and understand what needed understanding. The land kept its secrets, the mineral deposits beneath the surface, the truth about games played in 1889, the complexity of conflicts that had shaped generations. But it also gave up what mattered, the opportunity to build something meaningful, to stand for principles that transcended profit, to teach a daughter that some fights were worth the cost because the alternative was teaching her that nothing was worth defending. Connor locked the foundry that night after everyone had left, his hand on doors that had been repaired and strengthened, walking property that was his through law and through choice. Above, stars wheeled in patterns that had looked down on this land before anyone had claimed it, that would continue after all human disputes were forgotten. The foundry would stand, not because it had to, but because Connor and Sophie had chosen to make it stand. That was legacy in its purest form, not what you inherited, but what you chose to protect, not what was given, but what you fought to keep. Raymond had understood that, had gambled his last years on the hope that his nephew would understand it too. The gamble had paid off, and the foundry that had almost been lost was reborn through stubbornness and choice and the kind of courage that came from having nothing left to lose except the ground you stood on. That ground was solid now, defended and earned, ready to be passed forward to whoever came next with the strength to hold it. 5 years passed like seasons across the land, each one leaving its mark on the foundry the way water shapes stone. Connor watched Sophie grow from an 11-year-old girl who'd slept in a broken building to a 16-year-old young woman whose hands bore the calluses of a craftsperson who'd logged hundreds of hours at the forge. The transformation wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of thing you noticed day by day, but when Connor looked at photographs from that first desperate winter, he barely recognized the scared man and frightened child they'd been. The foundry had transformed with them. What had been decay was now restoration. What had been abandonment was now purpose. The main forge operated daily, its fire tended by Bill Thornton and the apprentices they'd trained over the years. The teaching workshops ran year-round, bringing people from across the country to learn metalworking techniques that most of the world had forgotten. The building breathed differently now, alive with the sound of hammers on anvils, the smell of coal smoke and hot metal, the voices of people learning to shape raw material into something useful. Sophie had become the forge's youngest instructor at 15, teaching basic techniques to beginners while continuing her own training under Bill's patient guidance. She'd developed an intuitive understanding of how metal responded to heat and pressure, could read the color of heated iron the way others read words. Her pieces had started winning recognition at craft shows, traditional work that honored Raymond's techniques while showing her own emerging style. Connor had found his own rhythm over those years. He managed the foundry's business operations, handled the contracts and finances that allowed them to operate sustainably, but he also spent time at the forge, learning alongside Sophie. His military precision translated well to metalworking, to the exact measurements and careful planning that complex pieces required. He wasn't as naturally talented as his daughter, but he was patient and methodical, qualities that produced solid work, if not inspired artistry. The mineral rights income had stabilized their lives in ways Connor had never experienced. Not wealthy by conventional standards, but secure enough that financial anxiety no longer colored every decision. He'd been able to invest in the foundry's restoration properly, to pay fair wages to the craftspeople they employed, to establish scholarship funds for students who couldn't afford the workshop fees. On a warm evening in late May, 6 years after Connor had arrived in Ashland Ridge with Sophie and $600, they received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Garrett appeared at the foundry's entrance, older and more frail than when Connor had last seen him, leaning on a cane that suggested his health had declined significantly. "Mr. Hayes," Thomas said, his voice carrying none of the authority it once had. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I've come to see what you've built." Connor hesitated, old wariness surfacing automatically, but Thomas's expression held only curiosity and what might have been regret. "You're welcome to look around." They walked through the foundry together, Thomas moving slowly, his eyes taking in everything with the attention of someone who understood the significance of what he was seeing. He watched Sophie demonstrate forging techniques to a small class, paused to examine finished pieces displayed in the gallery space they'd created, studied the restored equipment with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "Raymond would have loved this," Thomas said finally, sitting on a bench near the forge where heat still radiated from the day's work. "He always believed the craft mattered more than the profit, that teaching people was more important than making money. You've honored that." Connor sat beside him, the proximity feeling strange after years of conflict. "You could have had all of this if you'd been willing to let Raymond keep the building and just negotiate for the mineral rights." "I know." Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching Sophie work with a student at the smaller practice forge. "My great-great-grandfather's obsession became my grandfather's mission, became my father's life's work, became my burden. 4 generations of Garretts convinced that we'd been cheated, that rectifying an old wrong mattered more than anything else." He shook his head. Blake saw it too, that madness. I'm grateful he got away from it, even if it meant leaving Ashland Ridge." "Why come here now, after all this time?" "Because I'm dying," Thomas said simply. "Heart failure. Same as killed Raymond. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe a year. And I wanted to see if what you built was worth what I gave up chasing." He met Connor's eyes. "It is. This place matters in ways money never would have. I see that now." Connor felt something shift, old anger loosening its grip. "The card game in 1889. Do you still believe my ancestor cheated?" "I don't know anymore. Family stories get distorted over generations. Details change. Grudges become identity." Thomas paused. "Maybe he cheated, maybe he didn't. But 6 generations of conflict over a card game none of us witnessed seems like a failure of imagination on both our parts. We should have found another way." "Raymond tried. He invited your father to see the forge in the 70s, offered to teach metalworking to anyone interested. Your father refused, said he wouldn't set foot on stolen land." Thomas smiled sadly. "That sounds like my father. He died angry, never having recovered what he believed was his by right. I spent my life trying not to become him, but I did anyway. Just a different version of the same obsession." He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the cane. "Thank you for letting me see this, for showing me what I was too blind to recognize Raymond was building." After Thomas left, Connor stood in the Foundry's main space thinking about inheritance and obsession, about how easily grievance could become identity across generations. The Garretts had inherited anger, and it had poisoned their family for over a century. Raymond had inherited property and a craft, had chosen to make those things matter more than money or comfort. Connor had inherited both the property and the conflict, had to decide which legacy to carry forward. He'd chosen craft over grievance, building over destruction, and that choice had made all the difference. Sophie found him there an hour later, her face showing concern. "Bill said Thomas Garrett was here. Is everything okay?" "Yeah." Connor pulled her into a side hug. "He came to see what we'd built, to make peace before he dies, I think." "That's sad," Sophie said, her voice carrying genuine sympathy. "Spending your whole life fighting over something, then realizing too late it wasn't worth the cost?" "That's what legacy can do if you're not careful. Trap you in other people's battles, make you fight wars that should have ended generations ago." Connor looked around the Foundry, at the space they'd transformed through choice and work. "But it can also be something you build intentionally, something that matters because you made it matter." Thomas Garrett died 3 months later, and Connor attended the funeral out of respect for an old enemy who'd found peace at the end. Blake came back for the service, older and wearing success like expensive clothes. He sought Connor out afterward, the conversation brief but genuine. I was wrong, Blake said. About everything. The pressure tactics, the harassment, thinking money could force what negotiation couldn't. My father spent his last months talking about the Foundry, about how he'd wasted his life chasing the wrong things. He paused. I'm glad you stayed. Glad you built something that outlasted all of us. After Blake returned to whatever life he'd built elsewhere, Connor realized that the conflict had truly ended. Not with victory or defeat, but with understanding that the fight itself had been pointless, that both families had lost decades to inherited anger that should have been buried with the men who started it. The years continued their steady progression. Sophie graduated high school with honors and a portfolio of metalwork that earned her admission to a prestigious craft school. But she deferred enrollment, wanting to spend a gap year working full-time at the Foundry, deepening her skills before pursuing formal training. I need to understand this completely before I go learn other things, she explained. The Foundry is my foundation. Everything else builds on it. Connor understood, recognized in his daughter the same stubborn commitment to craft that had defined Raymond's life. She was choosing to root herself in this knowledge before branching out, ensuring that whatever else she learned would be grounded in the traditional techniques that were disappearing from the modern world. Bill Thornton retired at 70, his hands too arthritic to continue the detailed work metalworking required. They held a ceremony honoring his 45 years working with metal, first under Raymond, and then helping Connor and Sophie build the teaching program. Bill's final act was to declare Sophie a journeyman craftsperson, qualified to take apprentices of her own, to carry forward knowledge he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. You're as good as Raymond was at your age, Bill told Sophie during the ceremony, his voice rough with emotion. Maybe better, because you understand that teaching matters as much as making. This Foundry will outlive all of us because of people like you who keep the knowledge alive. Connor hired Bill's son Michael to take over the advanced instruction, creating continuity that ensured the forge would continue operating at the highest level. Michael had trained under both Bill and Raymond, understood the techniques and the philosophy behind them, believed in the Foundry's mission of preservation through practice. On a cool October morning, 10 years after Connor had first arrived at the Foundry with Sophie and nothing else, they lit the forge for what had become an annual tradition. The Anniversary Fire, they called it, a day when the Foundry opened free to the community, when anyone could try their hand at basic metalwork, when the building celebrated its survival and renewal. Sophie tended the fire that morning, her movements confident and precise, building the coal bed to the exact temperature needed for the day's demonstrations. She was 21 now, a young woman who'd been shaped by this place as surely as metal was shaped by heat and pressure. She'd deferred college twice more, choosing to stay and develop the Foundry's programs, to establish herself as a master craftswoman before pursuing other education. Connor watched her work, seeing Raymond in her attention to detail, seeing her mother in her focus and determination, seeing himself in her stubborn commitment to things that mattered even when easier paths were available. She'd grown up in this building, had become who she was through its restoration, had chosen to make it her life's work in ways he'd never expected when they'd first arrived, desperate and displaced. The day brought people from across Kentucky, former students and curious visitors, craftspeople and preservationists, local families, who'd watched the Foundry transform from abandoned ruin to thriving center of traditional craft. They moved through the space with appreciation for what it represented, for the fact that it had survived when so many similar buildings had been demolished and forgotten. Patricia Wells attended, now fully retired but still sharp-eyed and engaged. She pulled Connor aside during a quiet moment, her expression showing satisfaction at seeing Raymond's legacy not just preserved, but expanded. "Your uncle would be astonished," she said. "He held this place together through pure stubbornness, never imagining it could become what you've made it. You didn't just save the Foundry. You gave it purpose that goes beyond one man's craft. Sophie did that more than me, Connor said, watching his daughter teach a young girl how to hold a hammer, how to strike metal with precision and confidence. She saw possibilities I couldn't imagine. Because you gave her the foundation to build on. That's what good parenting is, providing stable ground so your children can reach higher than you managed. Patricia paused. Raymond knew that. Why he left this to you specifically, trusting that you'd understand what needed understanding, even if it took time. As evening settled over Ashland Ridge and the anniversary celebration wound down, Connor stood in the spot where he'd first confronted Blake Garrett and his midnight crew, where he'd made the choice to stand rather than retreat. The Foundry was quiet now, the forge banked for the night, the last visitors departing with thanks and promises to return. Sophie joined him, both of them looking at the building that had become home and purpose and legacy in ways that transcended simple ownership. I've been thinking, she said, about college, about what comes next. Connor waited, knowing better than to rush her when she was working through something important. I want to stay. Not forever, necessarily, but longer. Keep building the programs. Keep teaching. Maybe start writing down the techniques so they're preserved, even if the craft disappears completely. Bill wrote some things down, but not everything. There's knowledge in his generation that will be lost if someone doesn't document it soon. That's a good thing to do, Connor said. Important work. But I also want to travel, eventually. See other forges and workshops, learn different approaches to the same craft, bring back ideas that make this place better. She turned to face him. Is that okay? Building a life here but not being trapped by it? Connor heard the echo of his own questions in her words, the balance between commitment and freedom that everyone had to find. That's exactly right. Legacy isn't about being chained to one place or one way of doing things. It's about understanding what matters and finding your own way to protect it. They stood together as darkness completed its claim on the day, watching stars appear in patterns that had looked down on this land long before the Foundry was built, that would continue after everyone who currently knew it was gone. The building stood solid and purposeful, its bricks holding heat from the day's work, its timbers bearing the marks of a century of use and craft. Connor thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the foreclosure notice and desperate auction, about rocks through windows and midnight confrontations, about the choice to stay and fight for something he'd barely understood at the time. He thought about Raymond dying alone in this building, protecting it until his last breath, trusting that eventually someone would come along who'd understand why it mattered. That someone had been him, though he'd arrived broken and desperate, though he'd almost chosen surrender over the harder path of standing ground. But Sophie had helped him see what Raymond had seen, that some things were worth protecting not because they were profitable, but because they represented continuity, knowledge, craft, the accumulated wisdom of generations who'd learned to transform raw materials into beauty and function. The Foundry had taught him that legacy was something you built rather than something you inherited, that true wealth lay in purpose and community rather than bank accounts, that sometimes the greatest gift you could give your child was showing them that standing for principles had consequences worth bearing. As they locked the Foundry for the night and walked to the house they built beside it, modest but solid with Sophie's metalwork displayed in the windows and Connor's careful carpentry evident in every joint, he felt the weight of those 10 years settle into something approaching peace. Not satisfaction exactly, because there was always more work to do, always challenges ahead. But contentment with choices made and ground held, with a daughter who'd found purpose and a building that had found new life. The land kept its secret still, the mineral deposits that provided their income, the truth about card games played in 1889, the complexity of conflicts that had shaped generations of both families. But it had also given up what mattered most: the opportunity to build something meaningful, to stand for craft and heritage, to teach others that some knowledge was worth preserving even when the world had moved on to easier methods and cheaper alternatives. Connor stood on the porch watching the Foundry's silhouette against the night sky, its smokestack rising like a declaration that this place had survived, had been reborn through stubbornness and vision and the kind of courage that came from having nothing to lose except principles you weren't willing to surrender. Raymond had held this ground until it could be passed to someone who'd understand its value. Connor had held it until Sophie could claim it as her own heritage, could make it mean something beyond property or profit. The Foundry would stand after he was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would preserve knowledge that connected present craft to centuries of tradition. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you owned, but what you built, not what you inherited, but what you chose to protect and pass forward. Raymond's sacrifice had bought time for Connor to arrive. Connor's choice had bought time for Sophie to flourish. Sophie's commitment would buy time for whoever came next, creating continuity that transformed individual struggle into something larger than any one life. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human claims and conflicts, witnessing the slow work of buildings being restored and knowledge being preserved and families choosing to stand rather than retreat. The Foundry breathed in the night air, its walls holding stories it would continue to hold, its forge ready to be lit again tomorrow, its purpose renewed through generations who understood that some things were worth the cost of defending them. The land remembered everything: the conflicts and reconciliations, the deaths and rebirths, the stubborn men who'd held ground and the families who'd attacked it, the card game in 1889 and its echoes that had finally faded into understanding. But more importantly, the land had given what it had to give: the opportunity to build something that mattered, and people stubborn enough to do the building. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in brick and iron, in heat and pressure, and the careful work of hands that refused to let important knowledge disappear. The Foundry stood as proof that what was worth defending could be defended, that heritage could survive through choice and commitment, that sometimes desperate gambles made by broken people led to places nobody could have predicted, but everyone could recognize as right. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.